Good afternoon and welcome to this panel on flying blind, how the US funding freeze has impacted the humanitarian data ecosystem. It's a panel that we have pulled together between 5 organizations. We have Ground Truth Solutions, today represented by Sophie Tolstrup. We have here Geneva with Ed Schengenberg. We have Humanitarian Outcomes and Abby Stoddard. And we were going to have ACLED here as well, but unfortunately, Clina Rowley was not able to participate today. So it's just the 4 of us, but the background for this panel discussion is that the 5 organizations behind it, have reflected on how have we, in the midst of this disruption that the humanitarian sector has experienced in the past couple of weeks, what is the role of the data that we all collect, or the analysis that we do to try to hold the system accountable, to help the system make better decisions? What is the impact of us small organizations in the middle of this? And how do we have to think differently about our work? It's clear that this is not a time where we are going to simply just go out and say, oh, give us the money we lost, and then we go back to doing what we did. We have to think radically different about the way we do business. What does that mean for us as enabling organizations, as organizations who don't work directly with people affected by crisis, but sort of one step removed, enabling the system to function? What does that mean for us? How are we disrupted? How do we need to do differently? We will have, first we'll have Sandy Walton-Ellery, who is in Australia. If you know ACAPS reports, you'll have seen little drawings on many of them. That's Sandy. She draws all of those. And so when this thing happened, Sandy was part of the team that analyzed the impact, and we asked her to draw her vision. What is this actually? How can we think about this crisis? And so we'll start with that as a framer, Sandy walking us through her process. Hi, Sandy. Sandy walking us through her process of trying to draw what is an incredibly complex and difficult topic to come to terms with. Following that, we'll just do a round of reflections from the 4 of us on where we think we are, what's on our mind in terms of the rethink or the disruption or the pivot, whatever you want to call it, that we have to do. And then, I mean, looking at the room and who's in it, I'm sure we'll have a very robust conversation after that. So we'll just do one question between us, and then we'll open up and have a conversation with the room. All right? But we start with Sandy. Please go ahead, Sandy.
Thanks, Lars Peter. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm just sharing my screen now. So first of all, I'd just like to say that I'm in Adelaide in South Australia on the lands of the Kura people of the Adelaide Plains. And most of this work was done on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. So I pay respects to their elders and their peoples as the ongoing custodians on the land that I work on. As Lars Peter said, we've had a lot of conversations around this. And one of the ways that this this situation can be conceptualized for me as a person who likes to picture things so that I can think them through, starts off with a wall. And the wall is a metaphor of the barrier between those of us who call ourselves humanitarians, whether we have access to funds to distribute or the means to respond, or whether we're, as Lars Peter says, enablers who look for information and try to analyse what people need in crises. There's always been, since the time people first started to have the humanitarian imperative to go and try and help people who were not their own people, we've always wanted to know about what the situation was so that we can provide the right assistance to the right people at the right time. It's as simple as that. And the wall has sometimes been as simple as the fact that they're not here with us and we're not there with them. And in the days before travel was so accessible and communications were so accessible, it was often really, really hard to know as much as we might like to know about the people that we were trying to support. And because of that, I think for certainly as long as I've been working in this sector, which is scarily about 30 years, we've employed a whole range of different tools and efforts to try and improve the way we understand what people need. And for me, it's ways of trying to break through that wall or see through that wall. I mean, everything from maybe, you know, boots on the ground needs assessments as we go off in our white Pajeros, or remote sensing. We've tried to use different kinds of technology. We've tried all kinds of things. Some of these things are risky. Some of these things are multi-sector. Some of these things are carried out by the same organizations that are doing the response. Some of these things are really collaborative. Often there's a lot of data sharing involved. Often there's not a lot of data sharing involved. Some of these efforts have been really, really groundbreaking. Some of them perhaps have been really, really expensive, and they haven't yielded the benefits that we might have hoped. But I guess overall, what we can say is that we do have the means and we do have the capabilities, and we really do have a lot more understanding of what goes on in a crisis and how these different features of different kinds of crises, whether it's conflict, or whether it's floods, or whether it's a tsunami, or whether it's an earthquake, or whether it's some kind of disease outbreak. We know a lot more about how these impact people. We know a lot of different ways to try and estimate the numbers of people that are in need of assistance, and to understand the kinds of different assistance that different people need for different kinds of disasters in different places. Lars Peter and I were discussing the other day about, you know, things that happened earlier in our careers where maybe a whole shipment of malaria nets arrived to a place that actually had never had malaria. I have heard stories up in Bhutan where a whole lot of boots arrived after the earthquake, and they were huge, giant boots. And the Bhutanese people couldn't use the boots because they were too big. You know, we've all heard those kind of stories about how the wrong aid gets to places sometimes. And our efforts in trying to improve the understanding of what people need are about putting those people who are in need at the center of what we do. It's about not giving them what we think they need, or not giving them what we have decided they need, but giving them the things that they really need, that they prioritize, and also that experts know they need, because we know the consequences of certain things. We know the consequences of unclean drinking water. We know the consequences of exposure to the elements. By putting those people at the centre, we also have embarked on all of those localisation efforts. But the truth of a crisis is a crisis because local capacities are overwhelmed. So it's hard to imagine yet a situation where we won't need some kind of external assistance to support people in crisis. And it's hard to imagine a situation where we won't need at least some kind of external analysis and information providers to help that information get out and get to those who need it, to decide about funding responses, and to decide on what kind of responses people need. And it would be wrong not to mention the fact that these efforts, both assessment and analysis and response, have of course been underpinned by, I don't like to say it, but it is actually another plethora of guidelines and principles and documents that help us do what we do in the most respectful and dignity promoting ways. And we have those as well. And I guess one of the most key ones for us in this kind of enabling role is that humanitarian assistance should be provided on the basis of need. And it's difficult to do that. It's impossible to do that unless we know what the needs are. So that's one important thing. And I guess the other important thing is it also helps us be accountable to all of the different stakeholders we need to be accountable to the people themselves, to the donors who the money comes from, and also to the citizens of those donor countries who more and more demand to know where the money from their country is being spent and on what. I guess the concern that came into my mind when we talk about these funding cuts, we all talk about things being removed from the system, for sure. We talk about organisations and information facilities that have already been shut down or gone offline. But what I can envisage that looking like in terms of my wall metaphor is that those holes that we've created, those breakthroughs that we've made, those opportunities that we have to get information and to see the crisis on the other side of the wall and to see the people and to talk to them about their needs and their priorities are gradually getting closed off. And sometimes not gradually, actually, sometimes quite quickly. And as we close those off, we create blockages. And it's not just about the blockages to us creating a good report or to having information for the sake of information. It's the blockages that can actually impede assistance going to the right places, going to where it's needed most. We can imagine a situation like you see there, where the access tunnel that was last time you saw this wall open is closed off, where composite indicators that we use a range of different data sources to produce suddenly become less reliable and less robust because some of those data sources are no longer available. So we can imagine the situation where it looks metaphorically like this wall. And as you'll see there, it's not that we can't see anything, it's that actually there is an official channel for seeing what's going on the other side of the wall, and we're directed where to look. But maybe that is not an unbiased part of the wall to look at. Maybe that doesn't show us the full picture. So I guess in a simple way, this is how I see this. It is actually blocking the channels we've had for information, which in turn blocks assistance from getting to the people who need it most. So what do we need in future? I would say, if I'm allowed to be so bold, is we need to learn as much as we can from those efforts that have gone before. But if the truth be told, I think we can also be a bit honest and say that not all of the things we've done have been successful. And sometimes we are slow as humanitarians to, I guess, get rid of or release some of the things that aren't successful, maybe because we're afraid we won't find something better. But it's time now that we really streamlined this and that we made sure that we had the very best methods at our disposal as the ones that we chose to take forward, to have a streamlined, big picture view of what's going on and to be very clear about the limitations that we have and the timeframes that we need to work with them. So I think it's probably time to build something that's a little bit different from what we've had, but keeping in mind that it's the people on the other side of the wall that are the point of this. It's not just us. It's not just our lovely reports. It's that. So I think I'll leave it there. I'll take you back to the closed wall and I'll leave it there and stop sharing. Thanks, Lars Peter. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Great. So I think the metaphor is fairly clear. I think it's a situation that calls for us to be bold and radical. So what does that look like? If we start with you, Sophie, from ground to solution side, how are you thinking about this moment and what's the plan in terms of working differently moving forward?
Thanks, Lars Peter. Thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, what is the plan? What a big question. As I was waiting for this panel to start, I was just trying to arrange my thoughts from the week. And it's been really eye-opening. I'm actually leaving this week feeling slightly more positive than I started it, which is not at all how I expected. But there are sort of three things that I want to highlight here. So the first is that although I'm leaving this week feeling a bit more positive than when I started, it's been very telling about the state of all of our commitments to accountability and listening to people and putting people at the center when we're feeling stressed, when we're in survival mode and we're just thinking about the next step. Stuff that's really in our DNA sticks, and stuff that we've maybe paid lip service to but don't particularly care about falls off the map. And this week, I've heard and been posed some questions which in any other industry would be completely surreal. And some of you in the audience have posed those questions. The questions make sense in this industry. But imagine if we were a transport union. Imagine if we were an annual conference of supermarkets. Some of the questions about, do we really know what the people we're serving want? And can we really afford at this moment to keep accountability front and center? And whose role is it to understand what people in crisis want? Those questions are insane. These are the people who pay all of our salaries, whose needs we claim to serve. And the fact that these questions are being asked again and that participation and accountability are dropping off the radar, I think is very, very telling for us as a sector. in terms of where we're getting to. Ground Truth Solutions has just published an analysis of the last 2 years of our data, which sets out in very stark terms that we're not getting it right now, and that despite all the talk around and efforts around participation, listening to people's needs and priorities is still not happening. We're not getting the right stuff to the right people at the right time. We're missing the same groups of people that we have always missed. We're giving people bags of food when what they want is investments in flood defences, large lump sum cash transfers so that they can invest in the future. We're not listening and we're not getting it right. And at this moment in time, I think Lars Peter's challenged all of us to think about this moment in time. We see some very hasty decisions being made in behind closed doors in rooms all across Geneva and New York and the other places where these decisions are happening. And because participation isn't truly part of our DNA, because it hasn't passed the acid test, those decisions are being taken on people's behalves with a lot of assumptions. Those people aren't in the room, people's preferences aren't being taken into account, and it's taking us very quickly down a very dangerous path. So a week ago, I was saying this prioritization exercise could go one of two ways. It could either be top-down, led by who shouts the loudest, and it could be an exercise in what we as organizations have to give and what we want to give. And our analysis suggests that if we do it that way, we create a lot of waste. We waste lives, we waste opportunities, and we waste money, which is least important, but perhaps most persuasive in these conversations. Or we could use this opportunity to do something truly radical, listen to what people want, pull the resources from the global system that fit what people want, and build a humanitarian system that is fit for the future. So what is Ground Truth's action plan? We're pivoting at this moment from the work that we've been used to doing, this kind of detailed longitudinal work where we work with communities to truly dig into what they're experiencing. And we hope to move back in that direction again soon, and trying to feed the system at this moment with a snapshot of what people in crisis need and prefer, what they say absolutely must survive these cuts, and trying to provide real-time data that can provide a counterweight to some of those political pushes that we're seeing in the closed rooms across the road. I'll pause there. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sophie. Abby, do you want to have a go at the same question?
I say yes, but I want to give a lot of prologue to it. We were talking right before this about how much we should talk about the problem versus potential solutions. And I do want to get to solutions, but I also want to, for people that might not be across what's happening with data, I would just like to explain kind of what the issues are. We're worried about a network effect collapse of the data streams where USAID funding was responsible for all or part of these data streams. Many people don't realize how interdependent these streams are. One of my own databases, the Aid Worker Security Database, gets the majority of its reports directly from organizations, but also relies on 3 or 4 other databases to which we also provide data. So there's this cross communication and cultivation of data with them. So when the smaller streams dry up, the larger streams become worse. So in terms of the impacts of defunding on data generally, I'll speak from 2 perspectives that my work touches on, so operational security and humanitarian access and coverage. There's no one here representing public health, but clearly that's a major one. But just to point that out. So data is critical for 3 phases of humanitarian response. You have early warning, or what's going to happen or what might happen, situational awareness, what's happening, and accountability and impact, what happened and how we did. And it shows you kind of the who, the what, and where in terms of needs. In terms of operational security, data is necessary for prevalence and trend analysis, which is used for risk assessment, monitoring and reporting, for risk management metrics, for accountability and duty of care, and comparative geographical analysis, so you know how to allocate resources and capacities. With fewer data collectors and analysts, so less users and providers of data, you're going to have less informed decisions, weakened security risk management, and more danger for aid workers on the ground. In terms of coverage and reach, we've actually been doing some polling of national and local organizations, kind of how they are affected by the defunding. And there's a lot of optimistic spin out there about here's our chance to redo the system and we're going to go local and things will be localized. The reality is local and national capacities are shrinking faster and collapsing faster than international ones. The stoppages and closures are hitting local and national NGOs the hardest. In our rolling survey, 78% of respondents across 44 countries are reporting program stoppages, and only 2% are reporting that they've fully closed down. But one, we think this is an undercount, and two, as we were just discussing in another meeting, when local organizations lose funding, they contract. They stay around, but very small. But functionally, they have lost capacity with this defunding. So, and it's not small on the international sector. I know that Interaction is estimating right now something like 50% of their members will close, and the ones that remain will be working at 50% capacity. Maybe that's an overestimate, but that's what's been said. And already you have the hard-to-reach areas, the areas of greatest risk, and all of the most extreme cases in the humanitarian caseload are undercovered, sparse presence of agencies. You're going to see that even more. So it's just, while we talk about what might replace the current system, we have to remember that a system that was fed from the top down will starve from the bottom up, and that's what we're beginning to see happening. So in terms of what to do, we have to identify the critical data streams to be supported and focus on low-cost ways to get these and be ready to accept more quick and dirty, more good enough data to help decision makers focus their resources and capacities. That would include early warning indicators for famine and disease, basically nutritional and epidemic surveillance. Unfortunately, a big tool for this, FuseNet, is already closed down, but I know there are rescue efforts underway and hopefully something can be salvaged. You would need baseline data on morbidity, mortality, and food security indicators. Some of these are already there. Some of them are handled by national ministries of health. A lot of them got USAID funding, so it's going to be an issue for sure. You need some data on, so you can look at the severity of the conflict or the disaster. So in the case of conflict, casualties, and you need the demographic information for the numbers of people affected and the geographic scope of the crisis. Again, I'm just going to mention one important tool that I think is available and is not used enough now and could be used more, and that's telephone surveys of affected populations. You can get pretty good results that are statistically significant among these populations because cell phone usage and penetration is so good, and that should be just a no-brainer that happens as part of needs assessment. And that's where I'll stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Abby. Now, Ed, you play a slightly different role as compared to the three of us, I think. You run a think tank and you go out and you do reviews of the humanitarian system and you try to point out what's the gap between policy and practice here. When you look both at the scary statistic that you had about how many interaction members may disappear and you see the way data sources are being affected, what do you think? How is here Geneva going to work differently moving forward?
Thanks, Lars-Peter, and thanks for organizing this panel. Talking to a few people in the last couple of days, walking around here, I've heard a number of them saying, well, actually, we haven't really had the real discussion yet. Probably the best one-liner I heard today was, we're talking about survival of our institutions instead of survival of the people we're trying to serve. And I think that's very true. And I think the way actually we're talking about survival of our institutions is exactly the way it should not be done, which is internally sort of, the prioritization, if there's any prioritization that's based on criteria. I think that already is a question. But it's done internally instead of when it's most needed now to do that collectively. What is it that you're good at? What is it that you can deliver? and what is it that somebody else should do. A year ago, and this was why, in fact, I was looking quickly to make sure I was right on the dates, we're one of the organizations that does reviews and evaluations of responses of individual organizations, but also more the collective, so to speak, the system. About a year ago, actually, ODI, Humanitarian Policy Group, released the review of the humanitarian response to IDPs. I think Sandy's graphs, I mean, are really, really great, but I think she put it very diplomatically. And it's actually interesting for that review, which one would expect to be diplomatic as well, given that this was something produced at the request of the UN system or the interagency system. As for data, it concluded, for IDP data particularly, so on the internally displaced people, it concluded it's a Wild West. And so when actually it was a year ago that this review was launched in the Palais, and when the main author had done his presentation, saying, you know, obviously this Wild West, particularly when it comes to the data that is out there on IDPs, needs to be addressed. The first two interventions, and I mean, I could not make it up, but the first intervention was from the Deputy High Commissioner of UNHCR, defending the data system that UNHCR has on IDPs. The second intervention, yes, indeed, IOM defending their data system on IDPs. So this is exactly the Wild West the author was talking about, and it was exactly the issue I think he was trying to address in the sense of this needs to change. And so bringing that forward to today, obviously never waste a good crisis, but how, of course, the main question exactly I think we're all struggling with is, how are we going to come out of this that actually looks better than what we had before? And the problem is exactly that the signals we're seeing and exactly this individual prioritization, this individual survival, those signals are exactly pointing in the opposite direction than what we need, because now is really the time we need to have that collective discussion around the change we always wanted to see. So, you know, one question or one point, as here Geneva, we have always been raising, how many times do we need to carbon copy the same recommendations for the next evaluation? I really want to stop doing that now. I'm somewhat concerned that still we'll do carbon copy from one report to another.
Thank you, Ed. I'll also just say a few, come with a few perspectives from ACAPS side on how we think about working moving forward, and then I hope we can open up for discussion with the room. I think the first thing is we need to have a clearer story to tell about what is it data does for us and how does it inform decision making. We have had many conversations this week between us, between the organizations who are specialized in data collection, and we don't agree, right? And I don't think we have an honest and truthful story about how reality becomes data, becomes analysis, becomes a decision. What does that link look like, right? And specifically, if we take what probably has been the driver of all of the efforts around needs analysis and so on, so the Grand Bargain and the work stream there around needs assessment, it says we want one consolidated view coming out of the HCT, right? And I think that is exactly wrong, right? You don't just want one view of what happens in a crisis that is highly ambiguous and uncertain. You want contrasting and complementary perspectives so you can start a conversation about what the options are. And so I should have said, I fully agree with what my three colleagues said here. I'm trying to sort of complement with sort of the meta perspective on what is it actually we're doing. And I don't think we really understand what makes a difference and what doesn't. And I think it stems from the fact that we are so caught up in our own projects. We're so caught up in look at this fantastic map I've done with this data I collected, or look at this, look at what we can do. Where is the decision making in that? we say data 10 times every time we say analysis one time, and we never say decision making. We just don't talk about it. And the political nature of that needs to come into the center of understanding what are we doing, because if we're going to have to do the same job with half the money, we need to prioritize. And there will be some things we have to stop doing. How do you decide what that is? And I think it's a description of the reactions from HCR and IOM to that IDP review is a perfect illustration of that. Right? So how do we find a way of demonstrating what actually makes a difference and what is just useless? So that's one thing. We need to find that story. We need to have that conversation and find a way of agreeing on one side, the areas you mentioned, that we need information for this, we need, great, we need to listen to the people we serve. How does that come together? How does that inform decision making? Right? It's a very hard sell in a situation where we are going to have to cut down to say that we actually need more than one perspective. And I think one of the biggest dangers I see is that as the system sort of retracts and closes around itself, and clearly when you take away half the funding from a system, it doesn't become more generous or collaborative. I think you do see turf fights, no matter whether we're told not to have them. I think they do happen. And so how do we tell a story about the importance of actually having a conversation about what's happening and not just agreeing on one easy solution? That little hole in Sandy's wall that you look through that only tells you part of the truth. How do we do that? That's very much what's on my mind. And cost effectiveness, right? Primary data, secondary data. What's the cost of doing household surveys? Are there cheaper, better ways of doing it? Are we leveraging AI? What can we do? We have to get more efficient, and we have to collaborate more. That's why the 5 of us are doing this. We're trying to find a shared story about how we work with data, how we democratize, if you want, the humanitarian narrative, how we shape that. And so I think, for me, it begins with a new story about what data does for us, how it drives decisions. And it has to be a story that is much more collaborative than what we have seen today. And then it has to be a story that is where there's some kind of selection mechanism so that we don't just kill off what it is easiest to get rid of, but that we actually safeguard the really key data streams and analysis activities, and then de-emphasize the rest. So that's my take. Great. Let's open up for, there might be a question or two, I think, in the room.
Hi. Oh, hello. Is this what? Yeah, it is working. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm Sarah from CDAC Network. Really enjoyed the discussion. I just wanted to maybe provide a bit of a counterpoint as well on data. A lot of the places where humanitarian organizations work, there are basically data deserts, which are potentially becoming more desertified as humanitarian actors leave spaces, or they reduce their work, local actors are less supported. So the value of the data of the individuals in those spaces is ever increasing to not necessarily just actors like humanitarian organizations or human rights organizations or these myriad of sectors which we think of as different, but communities experience as one set of potentially people coming into their places. But also the value, of course, will be a lot higher to big tech who might seek to exploit such use and such data that there may be, in which the data, if it got into the hands of potentially people who do not care necessarily in the same way that I hope all of us in this room care about those individuals, could make them more vulnerable. And I just wanted to, if you could reflect a little bit on the idea of data ownership. So, of course, humanitarian organizations need data, and there's no doubt about that, to be able to make an appropriate response. But that data really does belong to an individual, just like I hope very much that generally my data belongs to me. And I just wondered if you could sort of talk a bit about that participation of communities within the idea of data collection, which could make them extremely vulnerable.
Yeah, I'm definitely not best placed to talk to the tech perspectives of this, but I do think that question of data ownership and of the role of communities in data collection and what happens to that data is super important. I was just on a panel earlier today about the importance of closing those data loops. So when we've extracted data from people, analyze that data, use that data analysis to tell a story to global actors, we then have a responsibility to go back to the communities, discuss the data with them, make sure that they are helping us to make sense of what they've told us, and then arming them with the data and analysis to go away and demand better from aid providers and others. I used to work in the tech for development space. My knowledge is very, very out of date, so I won't even hazard an answer to the techier aspects of the question and to data ownership around AI, but it's a super important consideration. And the last thing to mention on this is I had one conversation last week, which I found really heartening and surprising, which is the conversation was about the cost of stripping data out of the system and the cost of losing primary data from communities and what that means for the ways that we do our work and the ways that we understand humanitarian action. And this person was coming from a tech and data background, and I asked her about proxies, and I said, you know, I know people are exploring AI models, I know people are exploring what can you do with satellite data and call data records and this and that, and do you think that's a good substitute for what we're losing? And she really surprised me by saying, no, all of that stuff can be useful, but it's useless unless you can triangulate it with that sense making from the individual and with that primary data from people. So I haven't answered your question fully at all, but what I would say is that keeping the human element on the table, making sure that communities themselves are involved in sense making and that their data is protected, and that anything we do that leans into the tech space is triangulated with that human dimension is going to be really, really important.
Hi, Lucy Puentes with Start Network. First of all, beautiful panel. Thank you for pulling it together. And Sandy's illustrations are such a good starting point. It really made me think. So when there was the revolution in Libya, the streets of Tripoli were just covered in graffiti. And it was a real sort of demonstration of how the public were reclaiming that space. And perhaps it leads me into my question, which is on behalf of the Afghanistan Humanitarian Hub, which is one of Start Network's hubs. And I had asked OSED, which is one of the members of the hub, about their thoughts around data and analysis and working with some of the sort of the international partners that we have, including ACAPS. And the response that I had was, what about locally led knowledge creation? What about locally led data and analysis? And it strikes me that perhaps behind that wall, that we have actors beyond the communities. And so how do they maybe fit into that future ecosystem a little bit better?
I think I'll maybe kick it off and then yeah. I think one of the most troubling things about a lot of us enabling organizations who have sort of grown up at the global level in the shadow of the Grand Bargain and all of those reforms is that in many ways, I think we are attached to the existing system. A lot of what we do is created to correct systemic biases. I think, for example, what ACAPS does is partly is to control that to every problem, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail sort of dynamic that we see in needs assessment. So you need somebody independent to stand away and provide a second perspective to help correct those biases. And I think one of the consequences of that is that a lot of our efforts are focused at the global level where the voice of the people we serve are not heard. And I don't think we have been anywhere good enough at connecting to local perspectives, to integrating the ambiguity and the complexities and the disagreements that will be coming out of national civil society who don't all agree on what the situation is. And we need to get much better at that. We need a much messier humanitarian narrative. I think the danger is that it becomes so squeaky clean and scientific and 4.2 in this country and 4.4 in that country that we lose that, in a sense, what the colleague from CDAC network was talking about. We lose that connection to to the people we serve. I think we also need that squeaky clean. I'm not naive. I think we need, when we make allocations at the global level, we also need to have the 4.2 and the 4.4 and be able to compare countries. There's no doubt about that. And we need to do that in a good way, but we have to find a connection. And I don't think that connection is strong enough.
And just to raise public health again, when you do cholera surveillance, for instance, you use local data collectors. They're absolutely vital at the community level. And those data sets are prepared by having local health monitors who are paid at least stipends, and usually through some grant that is then funneled down through the layers of the system. So that would also go away. Having the local perspective in data, I mean, it's there anyway, as if, to the extent that data does, some data sets do start from the ground up, is also resilience for data sets. So if you can have redundancies and different data streams in different places, you're not subject to a single point of failure with your entire data set.
There is a comment online as well.
Okay, I can't see it. Yeah. And I maybe take one of these over here. There were two people here.
Oh, hello. Shall I ask my question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, hi. I'm Richard Britton. I'm from a company called Alsys. I've spent 20 years wrestling with this whole data challenge and information management limitations in the sort of countries we're talking about. I just want to comment and a question and carry on this visual imagery. And thank you for how you're laying this out. I think the honesty is absolutely vital in terms of really being clear about the degree to which data is or isn't being used for decision making. And it's very clear that in a large amount of cases, that's not the case. I've also heard through this week these narratives of data lakes and now data deserts. Now, what I struggle with is that the data lakes people are the remote sensing communities. This is the data from space and from social media and the big data tech, and there's a vast amount of it. And the data deserts to me is about boots on the ground, the qualitative dimensions, and to a degree some of the quant. And it's clear that if you're unchecked, you'll remove that wall in this analogy and flood the deserts with your lakes. And you'll now lose that local voice and the qualitative dimensions of what we're talking about. And you'll get suffocated by space-based data and people just stuffing data your way that is not targeted and fit for purpose. And so I just would love your reflections as a panel in terms of how you see this harnessing of this wider data, but in a way that's sensitive and appropriate, and can actually lead to some informed decisions that can lead to more sustainable impacts.
It's obviously a very interesting and good question, but the issue there, I think what we sort of, maybe we don't forget it, but what we need to really keep in mind is, or put on the forefront of our mind, is that there's a technical side to the data and sort of the technical quality of the data, so how sound and how credible is the data. But then there is a political side to the data. So, you know, obviously for too long we have been living sort of the myth in the sector that, you know, the better data we have, the better decisions will be taken. I mean, sorry, there's absolutely no evidence for that. And obviously in the decision making, it's exactly the politics that kick in, so to speak. Because then it becomes about agency mandates. I mean, it becomes about who has control over the narrative, because that, of course, in turn means who will get the money. So, you know, even if you're improving on the technical side and improving data collection and direct contact with affected communities, as much as, of course, I support or obviously, agree with that, Still, in terms of feeding the data to decision makers, Ukraine will get more money than Sudan.
Maybe a quick comment on, I really share your concern around the combination of AI and the availability of a lot of data that's collected from very far. And especially in a system where, as Ed just said, we're very good at making decisions without necessarily having a lot of evidence. We can actually sort of tell that story, shape that narrative without evidence being a strong part of it. It is a big danger that we can really make it look very good because of the new technology we can leverage, and really behind it is a very shallow understanding of what's actually going on. And so I think it is. I really agree, and I like the way you talked about the lakes and the desert. I think that is a massive threat, and I think when I look at this community in the room here, I think we have to ask ourselves the question: what is our relationship with tech, and is it too much, let me say, boys and toys? I mean, sometimes some of the projects that are popping up and that I see proposed are nice, but I struggle to see how they add operational value. And I think we actually, as a community, have to become a little bit less happy with the tech and be a little bit more focused on the user and the use case and the impact that this technology has, right? We can't just be parading around the next shiny thing every year. We have to make that link to the use case and to the decision making much better.
I have a mic, so shall I just talk? I will, okay. So kind of on that, actually, I wanted to make a comment. So apologies if you've already been in a session with me today and I've told you I'm new to the sector. But I've been in for a year, and before I was a teacher, and I work for a tech nonprofit. And our background really, now we're in the humanitarian sector. And again, if you've been in a session with me, you'll have heard that we have developed aid tracking technology, which we've piloted in Ethiopia. But I wanted to kind of just mention our funders are the Frontier Technology Hub, who are FCDO essentially. And I've just been reflecting this week on what a good model that was, in the sense that I think we can all say that we are aware that there is a lot of wastage in this sector. And I think a question we should all be asking ourselves is, am I actually doing something, or am I recommending that other people do something? There's a lot of funding that then goes to creating a report. I'm not trying to be critical. I understand that everyone is well-intentioned. But there's obviously money gets wasted in those situations. I've heard a lot of kind of calls to action this week, but I kind of feel like it's just words. And again, I'm not talking about everyone. It's just a few things I've experienced this week. And I think there's also a mismatch with, obviously, if we're all humanitarians, not that many of us are really experienced in tech. So there's quite a lot of humanitarians want certain bits of data, but they can't quite see how you could design technology that will specifically fit that data. And I wanted to just give kind of an anecdote about how our tech came about and why I think the Frontier Technology Hub, which hopefully will continue to be funded by the FCDO, why that's so effective. Because it was a statistician who was central FCDO, Phil Cockrell, and he, if anybody knows him, and he was looking for data on stockouts of ready-to-use therapeutic food in Ethiopia. And he was like, why is there no data? I've got nothing. So then he realized that that's because there's no supply chain visibility really at all in most of UNICEF's nutritional supply chain. So he, through this FCDO group, this organization, came directly to us because we have a background in that kind of thing. And he said, this is the problem. This is the data I want. What can you design that is low cost and open source? Because that's who we are. What can you design that will help solve this problem? And from that now we have had additional funding. Actually, our funding just ran out yesterday. But there's now so much promise behind this product that we've created. And I just wanted to make the point that that's a really efficient way of doing it. It wasn't that someone wrote a report and it was just went out into the ether. They directly came to us, and I think that that's what we need to do a bit more, match, humanitarians up with organisations like mine directly and just say, this is the problem, this is the data I want to see. Is there a low-cost way of you giving me that data? That's what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you. And lots of nodding heads as you, I think, open your intervention with you're new to the sector, and as you look around these rooms, you see a lot of waste. I think none of us would disagree with you. And I think at a moment where we're trying to cut the fat in the system, I think having representatives of so many humanitarian agencies in the same room, you know, you can't help but look around and think, does it need all of us? And I think that's very clear. However, on your point about lots of research getting pumped out into the world that doesn't do anything, lots of data that doesn't lead to decision making is also fair. But as Ground Truth Solutions, we see that unless you are getting that data, unless you are engaging communities, you are wasting huge amounts of money. I can shoot you my slides, which have graph after graph across 12 countries over the last 2 years of showing that if we don't engage people, we're going to be giving them stuff they don't need, and that's a huge waste. Let's take South Darfur. South Darfur in November was an almost impossible place to get aid into. There was a real trickle of aid getting through. It was difficult to get anything in. The logistics and expense and difficulty and human risk involved in getting aid to these places was absolutely enormous. And then we talked to people about what they were receiving, and what we heard unilaterally, each family was telling us what we need is food, and what we're getting is buckets and blankets. That is a huge economic waste. Forget the moral case, that's a huge economic waste. And I think what I've heard from everyone on this panel today is absolutely, let's not churn out data and analysis because it makes us feel good. Let's make sure that it's linked to decisions. But without getting that data and analysis right, we are going to be wasting scarce resources, which has a huge human cost. And just the very quick last thing I'd say on your tech point is, I tend to agree with you. I think CDAC is doing really fantastic work on responsible AI, and that's absolutely needed. And it's so far out of my comfort zone that I haven't been engaging so much. But I also think the reverse risk is true, where because we're not super tech literate as a humanitarian community, we can get as far as saying, whoa, risk, I see a red flag here, this is dangerous. And then we don't really grapple with the problem of, but if this is a tool that could help us do our work better and reach more people for less, how do we manage those risks? So I share your frustration there.
Thank you, Emmanuel, H2H Network. I just try to figure out, it has been nearly impossible in the past 2 decades to see collective work per se, you know, when we are talking about the key issues inside the humanitarian aid system, if we are totally honest. And what I'm trying, and in a period of growth, in a period of many increasing capacities, all the things have been multiplied in so many places. So I just would like, if you can elaborate, you know, the panelists and you, Lars Peters, you said we need to work more collectively. So how you can be really confident that in this current period of time, we can really work more collectively? And linked to that, what are you ready to abandon in terms of capacities, in terms of, you know, work that to respond to this obligation to work more collectively, practically speaking?
Great question.
It's called incentives. And the problem is exactly the incentives, the way the system is currently organized, are perverse, are exactly, I mean, and it starts with the dysfunctionality. The same agencies asking for the money are doing the needs assessment. So, you know, there's already an inherent dysfunctionality, so to speak. I heard one incentive today, which I thought, yeah, that might change. Whether it would be a humanitarian country team meeting, whether it would be an intercluster meeting, I don't know. But, you know, I mean, first start explaining what it is that your agency, only your agency can deliver vis-a-vis others. What is your unique, your unique selling point, added value, comparative advantage as such? Does that question ever get asked in a coordination meeting? I would like to be at such a coordination meeting. I haven't heard it, and I've been in the IRC for too long in that sense. So I think in that, you know, there needs to be a serious discussion now on how are we going to create better incentives as such that work. And one, I think, indeed should be around added value. Because earlier, indeed, I was pointing to these, I mean, you know, IOM is data center in Berlin, UNHCR World Bank in Copenhagen, OCHA in The Hague. Yeah, the reasons for that, because those countries wanted that. You know, the Netherlands government, and I was in those conversations, I can tell you, they were adamant on having OCHA's data center in The Hague. You know, I think there now needs to be a serious discussion also among those donors. Was this all what you needed? Again, so the incentives discussion is primarily one, in my view, that should be held with the donors.
So let me try to give you the thinking behind this, right? Because I think, firstly, why we have struggled with collaboration, right? So and again, this is an answer that comes very specifically from, I think, the analysis or the needs assessment space or whatever you want to say. I think for the past 10 years, the one game in town has been the Grand Bargain and the vision that came out of that, and we have all been forced to sort of center around that. There's been a very strong push from the donors and the signatories to the Grand Bargain to do that. I think for ACAPS, who believes that our role is to be independent and provide, in a sense, a second opinion or something that can help contrast that one consolidated view that comes out of the system, that has been a difficult situation. It's been hard work to really carve out the understanding for the need for that second opinion or that position. I think what you see here is a coalition of agencies that bring different capabilities to the table. Ed knows how to hold the system accountable and point out the things that they're not doing that they said they would do, as you have heard several examples of, right? And Abby, you understand data and the value of the data ecosystem, and you run two databases. You're an obvious partner for us. Ground truth solutions, you're much better at listening to the communities than we are. You get perceptions and voices in that we don't hear. What we're good at is to be the funnel for all sorts of different data that sort of comes together. And so I think what brings, for me, this is a personal answer. I don't know whether you guys agree, but what brings, what the beauty of this is the complementarity of what we do, and that we are independent in the sense that we're not there as we're not tasked by the system. We have some kind of relative autonomy in the way we work. And I think by combining our efforts, we can actually provide a much more comprehensive analysis or take on the humanitarian narrative, if you want, that includes the system performance, that includes the perceptions of the community, and that manages to weave together all of the data sources that exist. So that's the thinking. And that's why I started out by saying that what I'm really thinking about is how can we get that different story about what data actually is and how it works. That's so important for me, because we haven't had that for the past 10 years.
Pantomime-esque. Tony Land, ex-UNHCR, now with Fordham University. T.S. Eliot, in one of his poems, wrote, "Where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge, and where is the knowledge we've lost in information?" And I begin to wonder, as I hear the panel speak, how Ed says, well, you know, all this analysis doesn't really change the big decisions made. Ukraine will always get more than Sudan, who will get more than DRC. And so really, what use are we making of all this data and analysis? Does it in fact change decisions, or does it simply make us more accountable because we can show our analysis came from this data? And in all the Grand Bargain, the major emphasis was on localization. And so much of this data knowledge is centralized. You just heard the countries that have the data systems. The people who use that data, although they are the donors and we're heavily dependent on them, are on our side of the wall. And if we're really taking localization seriously, how much more shouldn't we trust those who live and understand and exist behind the wall and who want the food and not the blankets?
One point on that, Tony. I think it also relates to, for too long, and I saw a couple of very good contributions on that on LinkedIn, is and there's a real risk indeed that the system will still be the same system except smaller, but that it will be even more the monitoring, evaluation, reporting will even be more stringent in terms of what did you deliver, instead of monitoring on outcomes. For too long, way too long, donors are demanding output. What matters is outcomes. When are we going to make that change?
And just one more point on that is it's a great point. I really hear you. I think one thing I've heard this week that's given me some inspiration there is we have to believe and trust that putting analysis out there is not just feeding the one machine. It's not just talking to the donors who will always prioritize Ukraine over Sudan. Many of you in the room were at an event on mutual aid on Monday evening and heard from the emergency response rooms in Sudan. Because the data about what is happening, because information about the dire needs and what the emergency response rooms are doing is getting out there, they are being directly funded by individual donors across the US. We have to realize that in this changing donor landscape, we are not just talking to our friends at CEDA and FCDO that we've been talking to for years. We need to move beyond that system. We need to democratize data, and we need to change the narrative about what's happening, and there are others out there.
Couldn't agree more. It's a great point and a good question. I think we need a little more nuance, though, because yes, decisions are politicized, and you're going to see that reflected in funding allocations. But there are donors, and one was arguing with us this morning, who, when they are making decisions, look to data that's there to guide them. And the fact that there's information there to be known, I think we should endeavor to know it as well as we can.
Thank you very much. My name is Alison Hall. I'm the founder of a small NGO working on the ground in northern Uganda, Seeds for Development. My question, though, has nothing to do with that. My question is, how do you see the role of big tech in the future? So IBM, Google, Microsoft, and do they have a place at your table, not as a donor, but as a partner? And back to northern Uganda briefly, and the data deserts. The base imagery that our friends at Esri everywhere uses is shockingly poor. So the Google base maps are like 4 years out of date. So when we're trying to move forwards to do what we can for the most difficult to reach people, they're not making it easy for small organizations like me.
So I've been around for a long time, and it was over 10 years ago, I think, we first got excited about the tech sector and ways to collaborate, and it's been very disappointing, as your question makes clear. We've somehow failed to capture the imagination of Silicon Valley, and part of it is just that we are still dealing with physical needs in a material world that are not amenable to digital solutions, and which is really a lot of what they have to offer. I mean, there are certain things, yes, but one came to me for a meeting and said, how do we 10x this thing? It's like, well, we're not going to do it on our computers. So that's part of it. I'm sure we bear some of the blame in that we're not able to tell our stories as well as we should. I think the sector suffers from expert syndrome. We're all talking to each other. We're assuming a lot of knowledge that may not be there when we talk to people externally. So it's worth another try, I think. But so far, yeah, it's been not working.
Maybe two reflections. I think there are some things we can do. It's great to get free credits from AWS to experiment with AI, for example. I think there's some things that are really useful, right? I also don't think it has delivered on the rather unrealistic expectations that probably a lot of people had. But one thing that really made me think was that presentation, I think you made reference to it, from the Sudan emergency rooms, the way they have used tech, because they've actually managed to scale quite impressively. And part of that is because of tech. But they've developed their own tech stack in a really interesting way. It was not off the shelf, here is your non-code platform for all your needs, right? It took them time, and it really reflects the way they work and so on. And there's been some really creative engagement with a couple of organizations helping them with it. And the ownership of that tech stack is so much with the emergency rooms. It's beautiful. And so I think, what does 10x mean? And how do we how do we scale locally? How do we actually build a tech stack that doesn't disempower people, but reflects what they really need? It really made me think.
Thank you for this discussion. Heather Leeson, IFRC. I think you know what I'm going to say. There's lots of talented people around the world who have data skills, who have tech skills, who are shipping every day. So while the model right now on the kind of assessment level, we're thinking of institutions, and I really appreciate that framing. I also feel like there's no wall. I feel like we created the wall. And as much as I like the diagram and the description, I think it's good for debate, but is it that we see the wall? Because I'm wondering what local communities think. Thank you.
Heather, that was more of a comment, I think, than a question. Yeah, good. There's a question up here. Oh, I don't see. Oh.
There you go. Is it on? Yes, it's on. Hi, Ellie Kemp. I'm with Clear Global. We work on language, so that's what I'm going to ask about. We know that already. It's hard to get, we have found it hard on this side of the wall to ensure that we're hearing about the situations and the priorities and the needs and the perspectives of marginalized groups within affected populations. And of course, it's easiest for this Anglo-centric little world to speak to others who speak international languages like English and French and Spanish and Arabic. I'm really concerned that in this context, among all the many things we have to be concerned about, I'm really concerned that we're going to hear even less from those individuals who didn't get educated in the dominant language or the official language. And that means, disproportionately women and girls and people with disabilities and members of marginalized groups and older people and children, as a colleague reminded me today. So I'm looking for some optimistic and thoughtful reflections on how we might make sure what we can do in this prioritization that could ensure that we do still hear from some of those voices, and that's a more systematic part of the data set that we're looking at. Thanks.
I think that was also just a comment, but I can speak a little to how, yeah. At Humanitarian Outcomes, we've been much better lately, I think, than we haven't been great in the past about making sure our products are translated into languages appropriate to the context we're talking about, but more specifically to this conversation, in doing our surveys in the local language or languages. And that's one way that the remote surveys can be helpful, because you have call centers staffed with different, with the appropriate languages there. Yeah.
And sorry, Ellie, I feel like you and I have been having this conversation slowly over the week in different rooms. But I would say that is another reason why, if community engagement and community priorities aren't at the heart of what we're doing, we're going to miss the point. You've seen in our data that we are currently missing key vulnerable groups, and not even vulnerable groups as hard to reach as people speaking minority languages and the people that you've talked about on various panels this week, but we're missing elderly people, disabled people, female-headed households, children, people who we really shouldn't be missing. And to go back to South Darfur, that was a really clear takeaway, where people were saying, the aid is going to able-bodied people who are able to work, and it's missing all of these other groups. Just ask us, just include us in the targeting exercise. So at the risk of being a stuck record or a one-trick pony or whatever you want to say, I think part of that marginalisation can be addressed by starting all humanitarian assistance with meaningfully engaging communities, asking communities what they need and want.
The question over here.
I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Grace, my name is Kate McGrain. I'm also from a new and small organisation called the International Pride Centre, working predominantly around the inclusion of LGBTI communities, though my question is not specifically on that. And firstly, also thank you for such an honest and thought-provoking conversation. I think this is really welcome and will notably stand out, I think, throughout the whole week. So thank you for that. But my question is around, there's been a lot of conversation around feeding information and data to the beast, predominantly donors. In my experience, working across a lot of international organizations, international NGOs, is that, there are these massive data collection exercises which happen for that purpose. But then when it comes to the implementing actors, be they CSOs, national, international NGOs, often organizations have to go out and do their own assessments themselves in order to inform their own very specific programming. So I'm wondering, are there, again, in this environment, are there efficiencies which can be made around using, again, these data lakes and these assessments and existing data to also improve efficiencies for the directly implementing organizations who are also decision makers, albeit different decision makers, and influence differently than donors? Thank you very much.
I think as you were speaking, I was thinking about on one side the voices in the room who says we have, if we're not enhancing the agency of crisis-affected populations, if we're not letting them shape the narrative, then what are we doing? And we need to get much better at that. And then this other perspective with us going out and doing the expert opinion about what's needed here. And I think at some stage we have to confront those two perspectives and maybe say that maybe our expertise sometimes stands in the way of the local perspectives actually having that agency that we at least pay lip service to, right? And so if we want people to have some self-determination, they also have to decide what they want, right? So we have to find a way of meeting this very technocratic system we have that transfers resources down, and then the sometimes conflicting and ambiguous and different priorities of the communities we serve. And I think our expertise and quality control or sometimes stands in the way of that.
Hi, I'm Nathalie Herlemont, also with ACAPS. I have a question, by the way, but I will start with quoting a question from the chat, by the way, because it's connected with what was just said. Somebody is just asking in the chat whether these funding freeze or cuts will create or may create a momentum toward greater investment in local data initiatives and ownership. So I think it's really connected with the questions that was just asked. Or will local actors be further sidelined?
So in a way, what I'm hearing in terms of the conversation, of course, also in relation to earlier commitments, particularly in the Grand Bargain, there's definitely emphasis on making sure that the trend towards localization will not go lost. Now, that sounds extremely kind of vague or weak. The issue, I mean, so much more something that is much more radical is obviously making sure that, indeed, we're going to see the change that we always wanted. So particularly one concrete sort of discussion or even measure on the table is to make sure that the country-based pooled funds, which have been the main mechanism in terms of international funding through the formal system, to particularly local actors, that they would indeed become 100%. So the funding in those funds would become 100%, would be 100% allocated for local actors. Interestingly, that seemed to be a decision, and then there was in fact already reluctance. So that was a decision, if you like, at the Geneva level. And then, of course, unsurprisingly, there was backtracking on that from some of the organizations. So there's even still discussion on that. All of it to say, however, that, you know, obviously, if not now, then when? In the sense that now is the time to really make sure that in terms of making sure resources go to local actors, the country-based pooled funds are the main, they're not the only mechanism, fortunately not, but certainly are the main mechanism as far as it concerns the traditional or the classic system through UN agencies and so on. I mean, the reality is that probably still some UN agencies or some international NGOs want a piece of the pie as well, if you see what I mean. So that, I think, is still the tension there, but hopefully there will be much more investment than ever before in those country-based pooled funds. Against the reality with the decline in funding may, in fact, be the opposite, so to speak, but at least making sure that, you know, that this is a policy commitment that can no longer be put to the wayside, so to speak. I think that you know, is where we are at the moment, in that sense.
Can I ask my question now? So my question is related to, we had another session this morning that was about data and analysis and how this is connected with decisions making in area of access. And so we had rather similar discussion, by the way. And one idea that was risen was that maybe in order to avoid that the system just tries to keep itself alive a bit in the same way, a bit smaller, but still in the same way, maybe we should stop hiding behind the fact that we need, well, decision-making in humanitarian settings need to be data-driven and evidence-driven, and to try and put a bit more of reality and knowledge in those processes. So I just wanted to get the views of the panel on that question, that the fact that this data-driven era finally led with something that is hiding the reality, and we're hiding behind data. So maybe a bit of data desert may be a good thing.
So this goes back a little bit to a discussion also that I was involved in earlier today. Having this question, Natalie, is about accountability, I find, in the sense that you say, you know, sort of the decisions are data driven. For me, the big question has been what is happening at that level, at that moment that, you know, after sort of the needs assessment at the country, you know, and the discussion, so the sectors or the clusters, if you like, have done the needs assessment, that it comes to an appeal, so the humanitarian response plan. There is a level called the intercluster level there. Now, I've done a number of evaluations, as some of you know. It's still a mystery for me, and I thought for a long time it was just me and that I was alone in that I wasn't able to point my finger on what was going on there. My assumption was, and still is, it's horse trading. Now, I'm pretty much confirmed if I indeed speak to others there. So that's a black hole. It's unknown what's happening there. It is absolutely, you know, making sure everybody get a little piece of the pie, instead of, you know, something that is really allocation on base of needs and a real prioritization. You know, if you have 12 clusters, each of those clusters will have each of their demands. You know, you make a list. Who is going to say no to something? That is still, of course, the problem the system has. So again, goes back to the incentive question. So fortunately, people now, I'm hearing, you know, maybe a merger of clusters, fewer clusters, all of that. Somehow there needs to be a solution to this problem. I mean, that kind of decision-making around prioritization needs to become much, much more transparent. It's not. It's completely opaque.
Great. Do we have one online or, and then, sorry, who has the mic? This one here? Oh, sorry, yes. You and then here. No, you go.
Thank you. My name's Louise. I'm the head of the UNOPS Liaison Office here in Geneva. I have a public health background, but I'm extremely excited by this conversation, actually, and I don't think it is all doom and gloom at all. But one thing I think we do need to consider is, rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, UNOPS is in 100 countries, and we're permanently based in those countries, delivering projects which are completely needs-driven. We're not a member of the IASC. It's a system, it works to some extent, but I think what we need is a combination of what you're all describing, data or no data. The data comes from the needs, and the needs are there, whether there's an emergency, humanitarian, acute, infectious disease outbreak, whatever, there are always needs. And I think what's a really good model is something that we're implementing in Myanmar, which, to your point, is a pooled fund with a series of local NGOs, international NGOs, and other delivery partners delivering the needs which are being demanded on a regular basis by the community, for, in this case, primary healthcare. So I think there are ways we can do this and do this better. And to your point, you said we arrive and do our assessments. Why are we arriving and doing our assessments? We should be listening to the local voices. This is what we're saying. Listen to the local voices, feed those into the local mechanisms. And if there's data gaps or things that we think are missing, then join that conversation at the country level where those conversations should be had. And I think it's like a sandwich. Sure, there's going to be money coming from the top, but equally, that money has to be put into the pooled fund mechanism and delivering against the priorities, which can be prioritized at country level by the voices of the people bringing those priorities. I think sometimes we overthink this. We make our systems so complicated, and it really doesn't need to be that complicated.
Thank you very much. We have Elizabeth online, and then the gentleman down there.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Benedetti. I'm currently a consultant and leading a project for MDBs in data collection and data analysis. And I just wanted to ask, and actually is a question and a comment at the same time. I think that data is essential for everyone, being implementers in the humanitarian sphere or the development banks or bilateral donors. This is definitely very, very interesting. Unfortunately, every type of data can be biased and can in fact say what according to what is the requirement, we can shape data, and many times when we receive data from third parties, the data, there's a kind of uncertainty of the transparency of the data, how the data is collected, and I think being from a user point of view of the data, and you being the collector of the data, there is sometimes really a question mark of how much the data is unbiased and how much the data is untransparent and how much the data is inclusive with all the information that we need, instead of just seeing what is needed on one side and therefore the funding are somehow guided in that direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We had a long conversation this morning about whether we can say data is neutral or not. And I think I was trying to press the point that data are neutral, but the interpretations and selective use and selective collection of data is not at all neutral. And I think we know that the people in need figures is subject to a lot of political influence. And so right from the start, you're getting issues with data being misused. But I would really stay away from statements to the effect that we can't trust data. I think we need to make data better. We need to make capture better. And like Lars Peter was saying about having it collected by an independent body as opposed to the someone that might get money from the data appearing a certain way is important.
I'd like to quote Patrice Chatanier, who used to work with ACAPS, and he would always say, I don't want your data, I want your brain. And what he meant by that was that I want to understand how you did this. I want to, you know your data very well, you know where it's weak, you know where it's strong, right? So give me your brain, and then I'll take your data.
So first of all, congratulations to the panel. I see the debate has been very interactive. Secondly, I wanted just to bring this discussion a little bit back. What is the data for the future for? Is it to make the institution survive, or is it to do real life saving? And how are you going to get there?
Obviously, we would argue that if there's not a link to decision making that actually makes humanitarian action better, then why are we collecting data? Right? Data. If we cannot, especially in a situation where resources are being trimmed down the way they are, we have to get much better at saying what is a need to, what is a nice to, and what is just pure nonsense, right? And so that, I think, for me, the point is that determination. Back to the HCR IOM discussion about their IDP numbers, right? In order for us to make the right choices and have some kind of metrics that tells us what actually makes a difference and what just keeps the wheel turning somewhere in Geneva, we need to have a story about what that data does and what the link is to decision making. And we don't have that today. I don't feel that we have an honest and clear shared understanding of the link between data analysis and decision making. I think that black box that evidence goes into and decisions comes out of is very black, and we can't see what's in there. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, and I think that's actually probably the last question we have time for today. I'd like to thank all of you for your great questions and the discussion we've had. It's really been a pleasure, and of course a big thank you to the panel and for being as blunt as you've been today. I think this is a time where we can't be too polite, actually. I think we have to maybe take the gloves off and have some real discussions about how we do better. And I think we took a step in that direction here, so thank you for that.